the Good Girl Confessional podcast. Thanks for joining me. I'm your host, Sandy Lowres, and the Good Girl Confessional podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40, Women Beyond 40, a platform for women 40, 50, 60 and beyond. It is also proudly brought to us by the Alex the Seal podcast, of which I am proudly a part of with my lovely co-host, Joe Pybus. You can check out Alex the Seal, the podcast, and the Good Girl Confessional podcast wherever you listen to your favourite podcasts. Before I begin today's podcast, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today on the podcast, it's an absolute thrill to be chatting to a really amazing writer. Her name is Kirsty Jagger, and she has written this extraordinary book, which is called Roseghetto. She has drawn on her own life experience of growing up in a housing estate in New South Wales, and it is a bit of a harrowing, powerful story about a young woman who is trying to survive and figure out a way to get herself out from under the poverty line and to create a life for herself. It really is the most amazing book, but beautiful Kirsty has so generously shared her life story as well on the Good Girl Confessional podcast, and I'm so proud that she has trusted me with her story. She's a remarkable woman. This is an incredibly powerful debut novel. You will not believe that it's her first, and I'm sure there will be many more to come after this. Please welcome her to the confessional, the lovely Kirsty Jagger.
Hey, it's another Sandy here, Sandy Davies. I'm the founder and formulator of Happy Paws Balm for intimate dryness. Find us over at happypaws.com.au. That's happypause.com.au, and get some happy on down there. And in the meantime, keep listening to Powerhouse Sandy Lowres on the Good Girl Confessional podcast, where every woman has a story. We love this potty.
Hello, Kirsty, and welcome to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. How are you today?
I'm really well, Sandy. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to have you on because I have been reading your book. I finished it. I read it cover to cover. I couldn't put it down. And I will say to everyone before we even start, it's called Roseghetto. I'm holding it. I don't know if people can see it here because I've got a green screen, but we'll put up images. It is absolutely a powerful and incredible book. I'm kind of a bit lost for words about it, and I must admit that I completely was in awe of this character that you've written about, Shayla, who is wow, what an extraordinary kid. And okay, let's just jump into it. So first of all, congratulations. The book is amazing.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be getting really lovely feedback about Shayla and the book more broadly. I've been sitting with it alone for a long time, so it's really encouraging to see it through other people's eyes, and it's been really magical the last few weeks.
Yeah, wow. So I guess let's have a look at this book a little bit more in depth. How long, first of all, did it take you to write Roseghetto?
It took too long. It took about, I'd say, 4 to 5 years in total. So writing sporadically for about 4 years, and then a year of editing to get it to this point. So I work full time, so trying to find that time in between to sit down and write and be uninterrupted was quite difficult. I was traveling a lot for work. I was working on the 2019-20 bushfire recovery, and then floods, and then COVID. So I was quite busy with work. So I actually did most of my writing of this book during the lockdown years in Sydney. I wasn't commuting or traveling for work, so I was able to use that extra time in the day and really sit down and, fingers to the keyboard, get it done.
Well, we should mention that you're a journo. You're a journalist by trade, obviously. And what's fascinating to me about this book, obviously, is that the main character in this book is Shayla, and we live through her eyes. The story is really her story. And she grows up, of course, wanting to be a writer and wanting to be a journalist. Actually, she wants to be an author, let's face it. But tell me a little bit about that. Like, how much of you and your story have you drawn on, I guess, to create this book?
Yeah, there's little bits of me in the book kind of scattered throughout. The journalist part in particular. So I'm not a journalist anymore. I haven't been a journalist since that 2013, I want to say. But I was a newspaper journalist for a period of time. And I guess maybe it was a lazy choice to make Shayla a journo, but it made sense. I needed to give her like a motivation for going back to the place where she'd grown up. So I went back to Rosemeadow. I went back for a completely different reason. I was writing a book. Journalist by trade, my writing was really succinct and without detail and, no fluff. And I was lacking that detail of the place. So I went back to take still photos and videos to help me with my writing, and it was gone. And I felt quite wronged by that. I was like, oh my God, well now what do I do? Now it's gone. And actually that kind of gifted me the beginning and the end of the novel. So there's there's quite a lot of truth in the prologue and the epilogue around what happened on the return to Rosemeadow. But Shayla is a vehicle for many people's stories. A lot happens to Shayla in the time that you're with her. And yeah, there's a lot of different people's stories that have been collated and reimagined and dramatized and fictionalized and often taken to quite extreme for the purposes of kind of matching the trajectory of that book. So there's little bits of me scattered in there. But Shayla is really, and all of the characters really are composites.
Yeah, and very, very three-dimensional. Like, I had so many moments reading this book where I, wanted to hug her, where I wanted to get her out of certain situations, where I, felt for her, and I, my heart broke at times for her, but not just for her too, because the other characters that you've created in this book, in this novel, are also very three-dimensional as well. And I love the layering of the characters, and so showing us the reality for other characters that perhaps Shayla's not seeing because she's here and they're standing at the back of her, is quite extraordinary how you've done that.
Yeah, it's been really lovely to hear how connected people are feeling to Shayla, and lots of people have been saying that to me. I want to reach into the pages, I want to hug her and tell her that she'll be okay and that it's not her fault, and that she's a good kid. And it's for me, it's nice to hear because it means I've done a good job at creating a character that feels real and authentic and that people feel connected to. And people are rushing through this book, like they're like reading it because they want to know that she's okay. And the beginning gives you the indication that she's going to be okay, which I think was really important as well, because it does ask the reader to sit with some tough moments, and you do want to know that there is a good outcome. But it is nice that she's, feeling, people have come up and hugged me, and it's really nice because I think they just want to grab Shayla and be like, we love you and you're going to be okay. So loving all of the love for Shayla, I didn't anticipate it. So this is really lovely surprise.
And I can imagine, because I think if I was sitting in the same room as you right now, I'd want to hug you as well. I think, and I guess because, I'm fascinated by, as you say, like, even though Shayla is a composite character, I guess, of many people or whatever, but I'm interested to know about your time growing up and your time at Rosemeadow. And I probably should tell our readers, because I've read it, not everybody will have this yet, but I want them to go out and read it. Tell us a little bit in your own words about what is the story about. Tell us about Shayla and what the story really is about.
Well, I guess broadly, because I don't want to ruin too much detail.
No, we don't.
We've had a chance yet. So broadly, and it's an Australian working class coming of age story. And it follows the trials and tribulations of a young girl named Shayla as she navigates growing up in poverty amongst violence. And it follows, I'd say, the first 18 years of her life. You meet her when she's 3, but, we kind of, leave her at that kind of 18-year-old mark as she struggles to break free from the residual and compounding impacts of trauma. So it's quite the journey. There are some dark moments in there. But it is, all of the trouble that she endures. She's very resilient. She's very curious about her world. She loves reading. And she's got, her grandfather who's this amazing role model for her and is probably the best example of a good man in that book. And he encourages her to follow her dreams and you kind of stay true to herself and look to the future and the future that she wants, the future that she has control over. So I wanted to tell this story through a child's eyes. I think, when we look at communities like the one that is depicted in this book, most people will only have seen Rosemeadow through a media lens. So when things like the riots happened in 2009, they'll see it through the media lens. And that media lens, I mean, as a journo, we usually only look at it when something bad happens. It's not, it's not a good news story cycle ever, really. So, we get this perspective of this community, but I wanted to be able to tell it through the eyes of a child because I think it's harder to judge a child, right? They don't have a lot of control over their situation. And they're not necessarily choosing what's happening around them. And I think it's also really, I wanted Shayla to be able to look at the world with the innocence of a child's eyes without that judgment. It's quite matter of fact. She can be dispassionate about the way that she views the world as well. And I really wanted that because I want the reader to make up their mind about how they feel about what's happening. I don't want Shayla to be telling them how to feel. So I'm not sure if that completely answered your question, but yeah, I think, I don't know if it's a tangent. Sorry.
No, I think that's really, great. That's really, I guess, exactly what I was asking. I think it's quite fascinating for me, having never been to Rosemeadow or never have seen it, and to know now that, as you say, to go back and it's no longer there in the way that it was before it's gone. And you're right. So for me, sitting here, the only time I had ever really heard about it was, as you say, through the lens of media. And so I think it was quite fascinating as a reader, and for me, who also grew up in, maybe lower socioeconomic, certainly working class, but to see it through the eyes of children. And it wasn't just Shayla, but the friends that she makes there. And I think that was really beautifully done as well, because what we see through the making of those friendships is that there are kind and decent people around her living in these kind of extraordinary circumstances, which cannot be easy at all.
No, and not only is it not easy for children, it's not easy for the adults living in these circumstances either. And I think that's something that's really important that we recognise, is that it is hard to break out of systems and cycles, and it takes a lot. And if your worldview has kind of been shrunk down, like Lawrence, for example, I think she's a character that you kind of want to scream out and be like, oh my goodness, please leave and do this. But she's very isolated, and her worldview is very small at that time. And she's also, she's grown up in a particular time that's, she's an avid consumer of pop culture. That pop culture has glamorized some really toxic relationships, and she has this concept in her mind that true love should hurt. And I think, I think a lot of us grew up with family members who had a similar kind of perception of romance. And so she's, there's a lot happening there. She's got mental health problems, following the birth of her kids. They're not treated properly. She's isolated. She's financially, powerless. And she's relying on a system to safely place her and her children somewhere else because she doesn't have the capability herself to do it. That she's playing a waiting game. And that's a really tricky situation. It's very easy to feel frustrated with her. But really, I think what she's experiencing is really quite genuine, and it does show how hard it is to break free from those systems and cycles that we often find ourselves in, no matter what, class level we're kind of sitting in society.
That is 100% the truth. I actually didn't dislike Lauren, so we should say that this is the Shayla's mum in the book. I actually really felt for her, and in fact, at times my heart really broke for her, for being, I almost felt her disempowerment in a lot of these situations that she was finding herself in. But I could understand, also, her child, and I'm sure other people around her, her parents, everybody getting really frustrated with her and saying, just bloody change things, make it better. And you're right, it's not easy to break out of systems when you're locked into it. And as you say, I mean, there's a young woman who's pregnant really early on, who's in a pretty awful situation. Not, I don't want to give everything away, but she's in a pretty awful situation. And really, she was a teenager. So when you think about it, this catapults her into a system of hopelessness. And of course, she is isolated because she doesn't have any friends and she's got no money of her own and no way of holding down a job because of circumstances and things that go on. And yet on the other side of that, she has got these really incredible parents who are kind and considerate people who are trying really hard to help in their own way, but not really understanding anything that is really going on in her life.
Yeah, and look, I think Lauren. Look, she was my favorite character to write. I think she's really complex and like deeply layered and endearing. I really loved writing Lauren's character, and I think she shines in some moments too. You know, when Shayla's young and there's a situation with Shayla's father, she doesn't back down at that point. Like that would be a pretty horrific situation. She's quite a young mum in that situation, and she is on her own. And she does fight for her little girl and she does get her out of that situation. I think, that there are moments where Lauren's character really shines and she does look after Shayla. She does love Shayla and Shayla loves her. But she is meant to challenge the reader a little bit. But I think she feels the most human to me. I think, characters that kind of come in that shades of grey kind of piece feel more human. We can look at Shayla and she's a good character. We look at Rob, he's a bad character, but Lauren's kind of in that middle part, really navigating that human area. So I think she's going to feel related. She's going to feel very real.
She does feel extremely real. And I've got to tell you that I've met, people like Lauren before, and I, in my own life and in my own childhood and in my own background as well. And so I think for me, she felt extraordinarily real. And maybe that's why, because I'm not a child, because I am older and wiser and I'm, able to look back on my own life and my own experiences with kinder eyes, I think I really wanted to hug her as well. I wanted to hug Lauren and I wanted to sit her down and have coffee with her and say, you're going to be okay too and everything's okay and you're doing your best and all of those things. And I think that's it's such a testament to you and how you have written these people, how you've woven them into very real sort of characters and people, if you will. It was hard not to feel sorry for her. There were times, like, honestly, I got very, very teary for it.
And you imagine how different her life would have been if somebody like you had sat down and had coffee with her and said, hey, this isn't feeling quite right. Are you okay? And, she doesn't have anyone in her life at that moment to ask that question. So, I hope that this book raises some of those red flags. I think early on in relationships, sometimes there's behaviors that we think are romantic. Your partner might be a little bit jealous or they're a bit possessive. They want to know who you're with and where you are, and they're texting a lot or they're calling a lot. And it's nice to feel wanted and desired and all of these things, but some of these behaviors can tip over into really dangerous territory. And it's not okay. And I think, Rob's been very carefully designed to show just how insidious intimate partner violence is. It can slowly creep up. It's not always physical violence. There are all these other bits that kind of happen in the book, and they've been kind of strategically plotted into the book to show this progression of power and control that he takes of Lauren. So hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know in Australia right now, and globally this should be happening, but we know in Australia right now there's a lot of talk going around about what is coercive control. There's a lot of talk about changing law reform to protect people from coercive control and trying to have it labelled it is part of abuse. It is part of the abusive nature of abusive relationships. Coercion is such a big part of it. And I think I was a bit blown away actually there's a lot of subtlety in what you've done, but there's a lot of coercion in this book.
Yes.
And coercion comes in many different forms, right? It's the way that, abusive partners control the relationship, but it is also the way that parents control children as well, to in some ways keep them safe, but in other ways because they can't face the reality of things that are going on as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some moments between Shayla and Lauren where particularly as Shayla, gets older and she's a teenage girl and she's having relationships, that gets tested. And it's much more complex as well because, there is, I think, a genuine desire on Lauren's part to look after and protect Shayla. And, there's a character that comes in there and that is kind of, she's right. She can foresee what is happening. And, it was really important for me as well to show this mirroring of, some of the relationships that Lauren has had early on. We start to see Shayla kind of cycle into these relationships as well. And not identical kind of situations, but very similar. And I don't want to read it. I don't want to ruin it for readers in case, we're getting people that haven't quite gotten that far yet. But yeah, there was very deliberate plotting of we need to see that cycle kind of perpetuating itself, even though she's resisting it, even though she's trying and she's resisting it, it is still very hard. No matter how bright you are, no matter how well-intentioned you are, we do fall into cycles in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I do think that, and on this podcast, it's come up a number of times about generational trauma and how it is so prevalent in our societies. And it, as you say, it doesn't necessarily matter where you come from. It doesn't matter, what your socioeconomic background is. Generational trauma exists and, we are a sum total in some ways of where we come from, and it's how we are able to deal with certain circumstances in our life. But it's also, have we had the opportunities, have we had people around us who can help us to navigate those times in our life?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that people understand, domestic and intimate partner violence doesn't discriminate against class or, your background. It happens everywhere. It's horrible and it happens everywhere. It is a problem for all areas of society. And while this book looks at a particular community, that's not necessarily, accurate of what's happening, accurately kind of reflective of what's happening around the world and in Australian society. We have a situation where one woman a week at the moment is killed by an intimate partner, a male intimate partner. We've got a real situation on our hands that we need to look at and address. So I think it's easier for us to turn a blind eye. It's an uncomfortable, conversation sometimes, but actually we need to look at it. We do need to look at it and examine it. And, it's not enough to say, well, why didn't she leave? We really need to ask why people are treating other people this way, because that's where the problem is. And it's been interesting. There've been a few, interviews that I've done where people have seen this redeeming quality in Rob, which I don't see, because she has stayed. And they've gone, oh, well, there must be something. And it's like, no, she's very trapped. He is controlling her and isolating her, and she can't get out. And we do start to see Lauren through the different mediums and things that she's kind of consuming, that she is starting to plot her escape. She doesn't quite know what to do, and she's trying to figure it out in her own way. But yeah, it is an interesting conversation to have with people. I think it is easy to fall back and go, well, you just need to leave. But actually, no, we need to look at the perpetrator and focus on them rather than focusing on the victim.
1,000%. And I will say that, in my other life away from this podcast, I do work with a women's legal service. And I think that part of that women's legal service, the bulk of their work is really trying to help women who find themselves in these extraordinarily terrible circumstances. And I agreed, it is not easy to say it's very easy to say just leave. It's in the reality is it's not easy for women to leave. And you're right, domestic violence is at epidemic rates in this country, and we are seeing that. We also know, through research that the most dangerous time for women and children is when women get out of those situations, when they have things in place and they're finally able to leave. But it's actually one of the most dangerous times for women. And we see parts of that, and you've really beautifully kind of shown those moments in a way, like with this character Rob that you were talking about, who I can't find any redeeming qualities in that person at all. And I think you've written him, like, I don't know anyone who hasn't met a Rob in their life at one point or another, right? He's very realistic. But he, there's a lot of abuse going on in this, and it's not just physical abuse, although that is there. There is a lot of violence, but also too, we're seeing financial abuse of withholding money from a partner so that you control everything so that they cannot leave. Like, this is a woman who doesn't even have enough money to get on a bus to go to a doctor's appointment, for example. And this is common. These things are real and they do happen. Partners who have to rely on that abuser to even be able to afford food for their children or nappies for their children or whatever it is that they need. There's a range of abuses that you actually show rather than tell us, through this book. And I think it's so, that's why it's so powerful. I think the level of abuse that you've shown is so real.
Yeah. And look, and I think, it can be an uncomfortable read. Some people are saying it is uncomfortable to sit with some of these moments, but I think the important thing to take away that is, if you feel uncomfortable as a reader, imagine how uncomfortable people living in these situations actually feel. Sometimes we have to be uncomfortable in seeing the world so that we truly see it and we don't just see what we want to see. But yes, there was a lot of kind of research and intent that went into showing that escalation and the various kind of forms of violence that are being committed by Rob throughout that book. And I think the other interesting thing about, Lauren's perspective of this violence is that she is comparing this violence to the violence committed by her husband, Richard, or her ex-husband, Richard. And it kind of pales in comparison because he is so evil that, anything would pale in comparison, really, next to that. That doesn't make this person a good man. The bar for a good man is very, very, very low in this book. Like, it's, and, even Shayla's boyfriend, Noah, there is a moment where he says something to her that he absolutely shouldn't say to her. There is this sense of entitlement. And, I don't want to ruin it, but, he has a moment where he kind of says, I've never hit you and I've been angry. Like he's a hero. It's like, well, actually, that doesn't make you a good guy. The fact that you even think that makes you a good guy makes you a pretty shitty guy. So, there are lots of little nuances throughout the book that have been very, very strategically placed to make that feel really real and authentic. And I really hope that people who are having these experiences in real life feel less alone with them, having met Shayla and Lauren. And, I hope that I've conveyed them. It's not they're not perfect characters, but no one is. I hope I've conveyed them with some, compassion and understanding so that readers do feel that sense of, love and care for them as they're reading through this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure that anyone could read it and not feel some compassion for Lauren, some compassion for Shayla, absolutely. But you're right. I actually had written a note about that line in the book from her boyfriend because it's one of those things that we see it all the time in the media. Someone has been charged with violence against their female partner, and this libel law is that he was such a good guy. This line of this bullshit, but he was such a good guy. He was one of the blokes. He was on the footy team. He was all of these things. And I think there's a larger conversation, obviously, in this country that needs to start happening about that and what, as you say, what the supposed good guy is meant to be. Anybody who lays a hand on their partner, male, female, or otherwise, is not a good person. And but the headlines, when you read them about men who've actually murdered their partners, of football hero does blah blah instead of man murders man murders.
Yeah, there's an interesting conversation I think to happen around toxic masculinity, and I think people shy away from it because they think it's a feminist issue, but actually this is a human issue because it's not only impacting women, it is impacting young men as well who are trying to navigate the world and discover who they are. We want them to be the best versions of themselves, and this kind of culture doesn't allow for that. I just think we need to really collectively have something to say about that. You know, young men should be able to have healthy relationships with themselves as well, and be able to express themselves and be able to have respectful relationships. And that respect needs to go both ways in a relationship for it to be, you know, a workable relationship. But I think, yeah, there's a really odd hyper masculinity piece happening where we don't let, you know, boys show their emotions, and they, you know, it's a very strange concept that needs to be completely adjusted. And look, I think we're having more of those conversations now. I think a lot of the conversations that this book will bring up, I think we're having them in society now, and I think it's probably one of the good things that's come out of social media. You know, not a lot of excellent things have come out of social media, but there's been a movement towards having conversations around this. And I think women are feeling more comfortable calling out these things to men. And I think, you know, even so, I was looking at data I've been doing a few little op-eds, and I was looking at some data around domestic violence in New South Wales and how it's gone up over the last 7 years. And I was having lunch with a friend. I was like, this is horrific. Like, this is, and she kind of stopped me, and she was like, before you catastrophize, which I tend to do, maybe it's actually that reporting has gone up. You know, there's been more conversation. So it's not necessarily that the violence has escalated. It might have, but it looks like there's actually been an increase in reporting, and there's more services, and there's less stigma, and we are starting to wrap our arms around victims rather than kind of blaming them. And we are putting more onus on perpetrators. And I think it's one of the good things that's come out of social media is that we are starting to have these conversations and question some of the things that we've had kind of planted out in our mind. And these things come up in the book, you know, where the kids are like, oh no, you can't call the police. There has been this era in the past, and I think there's still a residual bit of this as well, where we're like, oh no, I don't want to get involved in someone else's business, or, you know, because you don't want them involved in your business, or you're worried about like retribution or whatever it is. But people are, you know, and I think this is across the board, not just in Rosemeadow and just not just in the western suburbs, but people have been kind of that understanding that what happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. This is your dirty laundry, you keep it out of public sort of situation. I think that is changing now with social media, you know, having, you know, lots of conversations from like, you know, the Julia Gillard misogyny speech right through to the Me Too movement, through to, you know, some really high profile cases that are in the media at the moment. I think we're starting to see a shift in how women are understanding how they should be treated in relationships. And I hope that sets the next generation up for success.
Yeah, look, I hope so as well. And it's such a complex, issue. I mean, we can't like shy away from it though. Like, it is complex, but the reality is, you're right. We don't know really, is it getting worse, or is it just that there's more reporting? I think in Australia as well, we're especially in Victoria, and actually, well, in Melbourne and Sydney, both very multicultural cities. And I think, so what we need to remember as well is that there's cultural issues going on here as well, that in some cultures, it's very much frowned upon to talk out against a partner, it's to go to the police. There's a lot of fear of the police for, First Nations communities, for, marginalised communities, for women who are actually here on visas. There's a huge fear of coming forward and saying, this is actually happening to me. And so there's a long way to go, I think, in terms of making sure there is enough support in those areas as well to keep women's.
Absolutely. There's so much more that needs to be done. And I think getting the conversation started is that first part, right? The more that we acknowledge that there is more work to be done, and that this is an ongoing issue, and that it's a humanitarian issue. It's not just a women's issue. Like, everyone is impacted by the outcomes of these toxic relationships. So it's such an important issue, and I'm glad. I'm glad this book gets to be part of that conversation. I think that's really important to me.
Yeah, and I can tell that, and you can see it even through your writing, like how passionate you are. But also, too, I should say, although we're talking about all the doom and gloom in this book, and there is a bit of it, and we can't lie about it, there's a lot of violence. But the really interesting part that I had all the way through this and why I couldn't stop reading it was because there's a lot of hope in this book. And there was a lot of hope for Shayla, this kid who, even though she's living in these really shitty circumstances at times, she's bright. She's so intelligent. She's living her life reading books, and she's crazy smart. Teachers are recognizing that everyone around her can see it. And she's very encouraged, as you said before, by the one amazing man in her life, which is, well, her grandfather, who's lovely. He's everybody should have a grandfather like that. He sounds really lovely. But there's a lot of hope in this book. And so I guess I really wanted to explore with you. So when did you know, I guess, like growing up, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer, and what was the moment, I guess? Was there a moment, or you just always knew?
I guess, look, I was a really poor reader for a long time. So I was a bit behind, I guess, the rest of my class in terms of reading till I was about year 4. And I was introduced to the Magic Faraway Tree, which is included in this book as a little ode to the teacher who introduced me to that book. And from there, I sped read through everything that was kind of magical and fantasy. And I mean, it was a great time growing up. It was just as Harry Potter was coming out, it was just a magical time for all of those things, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, before they became movies, these amazing books that were, I mean, I know they've been around a lot longer, but it was that time, that discovery for me of these amazing books and this incredible writing. And at that point, I wanted to be a writer because I enjoyed reading, and it made sense to me to, do something that I liked. So that kind of came from there, I'd say. But yeah, I certainly, Shayla is a lot brighter than me. She's reading from the time she's come out of the womb, basically. So she's got that passion from the get-go for books. I didn't have that at all. But yeah, there's that piece that kind of came from it. I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to write and was just, it takes a bit of investment in your craft. I don't know. I guess there are some people that are born writers, and then there are other people that kind of have to learn. And for me, I had to unlearn being a journalist to some extent, because you just write, maximum, you've got 300 words, and you don't get to have an opinion. And, well, you shouldn't. You should try not to have an opinion. And, it's kind of without the detail. So I had to unlearn a lot of that kind of to write this book. That's probably why it took so long. I had to do a lot of courses to get that across the line. So, yeah, I've known I've wanted to be a writer for a long time. I guess I didn't ever anticipate I would write this book. And when I started writing courses, this wasn't the book I was writing. I had a similar protagonist, but the book really changed. And I just kind of went with it. There was no point in fighting it. I think you also get to a point where your characters start to feel really organic. And so if you try and push them into a particular plot line, they just don't fit there. They don't feel right. So I did get to a point where I just felt like I was transcribing whatever Shayla or Lauren or Rob kind of wanted me to. So it's nice when it gets to that point, though. It kind of flows. But yeah, I've known it's been 25 years in the making. I finally got there. Finally.
Well, I can tell you what, it's extraordinary. I'm and I can understand that you had to unlearn certain things to be so concise at what you do as a journalist, to then have to put raw emotion and energy into crafting something that is this magnificent. One of the things I absolutely loved about this book, which I wanted to ask you about, because it was like these moments where I just smiled, was the references obviously to music and Lauren's love of music, which I think in some ways really humanized her and it made me smile. I'm a huge lover of music. I am part of another podcast on this called Alex Cecile, which is about 70s and 80s music. And so when the T-shirts were coming up and the solos were coming up, and you were talking about her love of music, and you didn't even have to tell us, it was there in what she was wearing and what she was listening to, that for Lauren, that was her safe haven, with the music.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's one of the reasons I loved creating her. So I did have a spreadsheet to create her. I know it sounds not particularly creative, but you have to kind of plot these things out, and it seemed to be the easiest way to kind of do it. So by chapter, I had how old every character was, what they were wearing, what they were watching, what they were listening to. And it was, I really wanted to play with this concept as well, that Lauren had been very much shaped. Her perceptions of the world and her understanding of her relationships had been shaped by this pop culture that she had consumed, that, I felt, reflecting on some of the music and some of the relationships that were kind of played out in the media at that time, were quite unhealthy and toxic, and not something we would necessarily advocate represents a healthy relationship at this point. And there are some interesting conversations between Shayla and Lauren around what masculinity in that era meant as well. And I wanted to play with this idea that she was very much shaped by the music and the films and things she was watching, and even the fact that she names her children after TV shows or after music as well. So, but it's people are loving the musical element. I didn't realize it would be such a big, when I was writing it, I wanted it for the sense of character, for the sense of time and place. I didn't realize how much people would really love it. So I've actually created a little Spotify playlist for all the songs that are in the book. So if you want to listen to the music while you're reading the book, you can. It's on Spotify, and there's a little link on my Instagram. But, people are loving doing that, and it makes it a little bit more immersive. And I did listen to some of these songs on repeat when I was writing different scenes, just to get the mood right, and just to, but yeah, the musical part's really, really amazing. I love it. I enjoyed it.
Oh, well, I wanted to thank you for it, because I just thought it was amazing. And you're right, little absolute snapshots of time, and took me back, when I heard you were talking about the Divinals, and you were talking about the songs that came up for me, took me back, and I have memories of those times, good, bad, and ugly, all of those things. And I thought, wow, it's so amazing. But I loved, you could almost see time moving with the songs as well, which was so clever. Songs that would start out she names her kid after a song, and I don't want to give that away, so we'll let everybody read that, but one of my favorite bands of all time. And really interestingly, as you say, that the mum is sharing with her child about why she named her that, and about the band, and about the relationship between the band members. And you're right, such an incredible little snapshot in time that wouldn't be tolerated now.
And I think,
right, it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, just to, I think the music and the films that Lauren listens to, there's a shift. And just like with Shayla reading certain books, there's a shift. So she goes from reading quite magical books to reading, there's a quite pivotal conversation that happens with Sean, her friend, who lives on the street with her. And that conversation shifts the kind of books that Shayla starts reading. So she's shifted from, Harry Potter to Lord of the Flies. There are these shifts, and you can see that she's kind of shifted so she can understand her world and navigate her way better through it. But Lauren does something similar as well, where we start to see her perception of her relationship shift as well through music and through film. So I really wanted to play with that piece. And I think we all have these. I love music. So, I have a playlist for when I take off in a plane, which is, a big moment for me. I love flying. So, I've got a playlist for takeoff, or a breakup. I've got a song for when I quit a job. I have, and I think we all do. We have that song that we have with our special person, or our first kiss, or, our first big fight, or whatever it might be. We have a song for it. And, these characters really bring that to life.
Yeah, they really, really do. And I'm so thrilled to hear that there is a playlist, and I'd encourage everyone to have a listen to it as they're reading the book, because I am in my 50s, and for me, again, I was sort of catapulted back into certain moments in my life because of those songs, and going, oh, wow, I can actually remember who I was dating, and I can remember, how I was feeling, and I can remember moments with my parents. I have a massive love of music, and I think that music and books really saved me so many times throughout my life, I think, of being this kid growing up in as a the western suburbs kid. And and sometimes really difficult moments in my life. And music and books were what got me through and allowed me to, escape. It's my escapism, and it still is today when I think about it. Like I'll turn on loud music while I do housework, and if things are going on in my life, there's certain things that I love to listen to, and so many playlists like you. I love that, but I think that that's such a clever way to form a narrative. And you're right, the way that you show what she's reading and the moments when she's reading them help us to see, I guess, her growing up and this narrative though, and her self-belief and her belief in the world. And again, you show us rather than just ram it down our throat. It's so pivotal, though, some of those conversations that she has. And, there's two friends that she has in this book, Sean and Charlie, and I was in love with them. I just thought, wow, those kids, I grew up with those kids in my neighborhood, even though they had different names. And I loved it. And I thought, again, showing through Sean, her little mate who lived up the street from her, that he was a decent, gorgeous, kind kid. He was a really good example of a really good boy, a good kid, And then I couldn't help but thinking, what's going to happen to him? What will happen to him if he stays in that place? Where will he end up? And Charlie as well.
I like to think that they got their happily ever afters. That's the beauty of fiction, right? You can give your characters that, and I'd like to think they got their happily ever afters. And people are asking me, are these based on real people? And no, they're not. I created Charlie and Sean because I wanted Shayla to have someone around her age. Firstly, she needed some friends because, she's alone. She's sitting alone with a lot of stuff that's happening. So, to give the reader some reprieve there as well. But also, I didn't want to write internal monologues because I didn't want Shayla to tell the reader how to feel or how she was feeling. I wanted her to have someone around her own age to kind of bounce those ideas off. And there are some pretty big questions and pretty big conversations that Sean and Charlie have. But I think... Sean and Shayla. But I think the other thing is I wanted to also show how their parents had come to be where they were. I think we make a lot of assumptions about people choosing to live in these situations. And having lived in these situations, I can honestly say I don't think anyone who felt they had a real way out would choose to live below the poverty line. It's not fun, and even if you are getting some support, it doesn't close that gap. I don't think anyone would deliberately choose that. I think people get stuck, and it feels like a safety net because they're not sure what would happen if they stepped outside, and they're scared. They're scared of what that looks like. So I think there's that sense of being trapped in that. But, a lot of the people who have, come in, Shayla and Lauren come in, it's through no fault of their own that they've ended up in this housing system. In a similar way, although there is violence in Charlie's home, her dad's, a veteran, and Sean's dad has been injured in a workplace injury, and these people, are injured and traumatized, and, they need this system to support them. And so, while I think I've tried to show that people don't just stay in here for the sake of staying in here. Some people come through different circumstances that have happened in their life that sometimes have happened at the hands of other people. And we should never be too quick to judge. We shouldn't be quick to judge the person who hasn't mowed their front lawn because maybe they can't actually pull the lawnmower. Maybe it's broken and they can't. We're quick to kind of make judgments about people, but we don't know them. So we should be looking. I hope that this book provides a kinder lens through which to view people and places and communities that we're quick to judge, because there's a lot that we don't know about what's going on in people's homes and in their heads and in their hearts. We should be trying to be kind.
I think it certainly does that. And as I said, I think that, me as a reader and having come from, everybody's circumstances are different, but having had moments of some of this stuff in my life of looking back with kinder eyes as a grown up, but actually then reading something like what you've written is it's really powerful in some ways. It's a little bit healing for a lot, and I'm sure it will be for a lot of people reading it who think, oh yeah, I was that kid, or I came from those circumstances, but I came out okay as well. I'm okay. Which is really important. But as you say, I think it's such a powerful and beautiful book. I hope lands in the hands of many teenagers who perhaps are currently in this situation, but feeling like, am I ever going to get out, and what does get out mean, which is very different for a lot of people as well. But to feel safe and to hopefully know that there is hope on the other side as well.
Absolutely.
And I hope that there are, parents and grown-ups and who get to read this book as well and actually are a little bit kinder and gentler with themselves for decisions that they had to make in moments in their life, and that they were doing the best they could with what they had at the time.
Absolutely. I do. I hope that I think everyone can relate to, you may not be able to relate to all of the struggles that Shayla has had, but I would find it, I think it would be very rare to find, particularly a woman who hasn't had one of these experiences that she's had in her life. And I think, if you'll feel less alone having heard her voice and held her hand on this journey. And I think that's really important. And it's lovely to see that coming back in through reviews and feedback that's coming in from people. That's really, and I think the other thing for me is that when people, particularly young people, have been impacted by trauma, and there's a conversation with Shayla's grandparents around this, there's this expectation or assumption that they will not reach their full potential. And that's not necessarily true. Shayla is incredibly resilient, and she kind of doesn't hold on to this trauma. It does subconsciously kind of perpetuate itself, but she's not holding on to it and kind of letting it stop her from being the best version of herself. It does subconsciously impact her, but she's still striving towards something, and she does achieve it. And she saves herself. There's no one who swoops in and saves her. She fights her own battle and she wins. And I think that's a really important story to tell, of a young woman being incredibly resilient and against all odds, winning.
Yeah, I agree. You know what else I loved as well, and I just have to say it, is watching the interaction with her, or reading about the interaction with her and her teacher. There's a couple of teachers in this book, but so extraordinary because I remember being in high school and having these amazing kind of teachers. I was very, very lucky, who really stepped in and kind of guided me and said, what is your hurry to do all these different things and blah, blah, blah. And, you can be something and you can make something of yourself, and you have to want it for yourself. And I think there's a beautiful line in this book that says, what do you want? What do you want? Why are you have to think, and her grandfather says it as well, well, what do you want? I think for anyone listening as well, first of all, please go out and buy this book and read the book. But if just for anyone listening, sometimes a kind word, really seeing someone and listening to someone can really change someone's life, like genuinely change their life. And I know for me, there are words burnt into my mind that my English teacher said to me, and she is now a young adult author and went off and did amazing things. And I just remember thinking, I want to grow up and be like you. I want to be that. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. And I think there's a pivotal moment there where Shayla is seen by an ex-boyfriend, but also her grandfather, and she's been feeling invisible, and she's on the cusp of making an incredibly horrendous decision. And it stops her because she is seen. Somebody has recognized her and acknowledged her existence, and that she's steering the ship now, and she should be steering it towards the horizon that she wants to kind of find. So I think it's a really important message. Do treat people with kindness, and you never quite know where they're at on their journey or how they came to be where they are. We've all got stories. That's why so many people want to write books, right? We've all had a journey, we've all had a story. So be kind.
Very, very true. And for you, let's talk about, you had mentors, which is amazing, especially in the writing of this book. So tell me a little bit more about that, on how it came to be, because you won the Heyman Mentorship Award. That's huge. It's huge. Tell me about that.
Yes, that completely changed the trajectory of my writing career. Like, this book wouldn't be where it is today without that. And I think, it gives your manuscript a bit of a leg up if you win an award before you have published a book. Like, that's pretty, like, it gives it this world of opportunity that it may not necessarily have had before that. But Kathryn is an incredible writer, an amazing mentor, and just a beautiful human being. And I feel so lucky. I think some people just come into your life at the right time. I can't. There are no words for how grateful I am. She's, I have no words. But she really changed how I moved forward with this. And she saw potential in what I thought was a pipe dream, and she really believed in it. So it also helps when you've got someone who believes in your project to kind of keep you accountable and to keep you kind of inspired. And that really helped me along that journey when, I was like, well, now I've got to write because she's expecting 10,000 words. Now I have to sit down and meet this deadline. So yeah, like having a mentor, if you can find a mentor, and I think, not everyone can afford mentoring programs and things like that. But if you're a writer and, there's so many other ways, like join a writing group, do free webinars, read a lot, borrow craft books from the library. All of these things will help you with your writing, and I had a writing group as well, and they were really invaluable in terms of their support and, God, the rough drafts that they would have seen. But they created a safe space to do that, so, and provided really kind and genuine and insightful feedback, which is always helpful. Sometimes it can be a little bit upsetting, but, these things help. And, once Kathryn and I had got the book to the best possible place, it went to Aviva, my publisher, who is also just there's been an incredible group of women who have worked on this book. And I feel so lucky to have worked with them. They've been so kind and generous, and their expertise has just been incredible. And I felt in safe hands. So, a lot of the time I was like, yep, I totally trust your judgment. I think there was only one thing Aviva and I disagreed on, and she came around. I was like, what? Let's get this. And she was like, okay. But yeah, like you've really got to trust your publishing team. I think you need to feel safe with them, and particularly when a work like this is my first work. I've been working on it for a long time. You do feel like every word is golden. It helps to have someone who's an absolute gun look at it and go, no, we're just going to cut out these 20,000 words now. And you're like, oh my, can I just sleep with that group? Yeah, I know how it's, but also like these people have your best interests and your book's best interests at heart, and they do this every day. And I think when you're writing on your own, it's hard to sometimes see, like I knew it was too long and I was like, I don't know where to cut it. Can you please help me? So that really helped. So, there's been an amazing team of people that have been with this book from its first draft through to its publication. I'm very, very, very lucky.
Yeah, which is so amazing. And it's really, I'm going to say, I am blessed that, having been a reader my whole life, I am in this very lucky situation where I have this podcast and I get to read lots of amazing books. And it is really hard to believe, if I'm honest, that this is a debut novel because it's so well crafted. It's so beautifully written. It's gripping from start to finish. And you really, really, through this amazing character, took us along on a journey. And as she said, I felt like I got to hold her hand and get to the end. And at the end, I just honestly, and I it's hard because I don't want to say anything that's going to give this away, but I will say that you won't be able to stop reading until you get to the very end.
Yeah, and people are reading it very quickly. I think they're very determined to see what happens to Shayla. I did an interview the other day and the lady hadn't quite made it to the end, and she asked me this question, which would totally have destroyed the ending for her. And I was like, just call me back in a couple of days. I'll answer that question. I was like, I don't want to ruin this for you, but I'm happy to take another phone call about, the ending. So, but yeah, it is lovely. Thank you so much for all the nice things you said about it. It's so nice to hear that. I've been terrified about it coming out, so this is very nice for me.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that. It must be really, I recently got to speak to Megan Rogers, who has a debut novel as well. And I was asking her, how did it feel when you finally had to put it out into the world? And she said the same as you, that I was terrified. I was nervous. I was really nervous about what would people think and say. And
I mean, we read the panic attack. Yeah, no, it's lovely. It's, you know, I think as writers, you're usually quite introverted. So like, you know, I'm a learned extrovert for work. But I tend to come away from things feeling quite drained. So I have to go to power saving mode for a little bit. So there's that. And also, you know, having been a journalist, I'm used to sitting on the other side of this where I'm asking the questions, not answering them. So that is terrifying as well sometimes, particularly because you go in and you don't necessarily know what you're going to be asked. But also sometimes I have this imposter syndrome where I'm like, I'm not as smart as the person interviewing me. And what about they ask me this really hard question? And I don't know what to say. And that happened the other day where this man who was so thoughtful and so into the book asked me this question and I just froze. And I was like, I don't know the answer to that.
I don't even know the answer to that.
That's it. But also sometimes because you're seeing your book through other people's eyes, they're asking about things you haven't necessarily considered yet. Because, you know, as much as you want to say you've been very deliberate about all of the things that you've written, often you haven't. And I've read this book, you know, a million times now. And every single time I find something different in it. Or someone will come to me with a fresh perspective and I'm like, wow, I hadn't thought about that. That's amazing. And it's sometimes just a happy accident or, you know, it's subconscious creativity or whatever it is. But it is terrifying. And also, you know, often I think writers don't like to share their writing until it's published. And then so few people have seen that you actually don't have a real gauge, apart from the fact that your publisher wants to deem it publishable. You don't have a real gauge on how other people are going to receive it. So those first few weeks are lovely and terrifying. It's a great problem to have, but it is for writers who are, you know, sensitive about their work and naturally quite introverted, I think it is a terrifying time. But I've got a great team sitting around me, which has been fabulous, and they've been looking after me very well. So feeling very lucky about that.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
That is so great. One last question I wanted to ask you. What did it feel like the first time you had that book in your hands and you realised, well, this is real, I've really done this?
When the book arrived, I was in my pajamas and I was like, no, I can't open it like this. I must be dressed and ready and I must look presentable to my book upon the opening of this box. So I had a shower, did my hair, got dressed, got my makeup on, and then I opened the box and then I cried. So all of the makeup disappeared. So no, it was, you know, there is that moment of like opening it and then you like that moment of holding the physical copy and going like, it's amazing that it's done. Oh my God, it's a real book. Like it's a real book. And I think the other thing is the first time you see it in a bookshop, where I went through a similar process. So I went to the shops and I stood outside the bookstore for a few minutes and then I was like, no, because I'd gone in like my Ugg boots and my trackies and my hair was in a bun and I had no makeup and I was like, I'm not presentable for my book. So I had to go home and come back another day to see my book in the shop. So, you know, which is probably not the process that everyone goes through, but it's the process I went through in my own weird way. But yeah, I was in tears. It's a dream come true. It also feels a little bit surreal. I'm still waiting to wake up from this dream and I'm hoping I don't. I'm hoping this is real. But sometimes it feels too good to be true and you're just waiting for that moment for the rug to be ripped from underneath you. So hopefully that doesn't happen and things continue to trot along this nice little path that we're on at the moment.
Oh my God, I love that you were showing this book so much reverence as well. Respect and going home and getting you're amazing.
Whenever I had to like clean the house, I was like, oh my God, it's arrived. It's like having a person over. It's like my house is a mess. I have to shower, I have to vacuum, and I went through the whole process before I opened the box. So just slight new growth.
I love that though, because it's a significant moment in your life, and I'm glad that you treated your book with so much reverence because Having read it, I'm a huge fan of this book now, and it deserves every bit of respect and reverence. And I'm thrilled that people are loving it, that people are reviewing it so beautifully and kindly. I will put up links everywhere for where people can follow you and follow this book and its journey. Roseghetto is a sensationally beautiful book. Thank you so much for putting it out in the world and for allowing us to have a little bit of a snapshot into Rosemeadow and the lives there.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading it. And thank you for having me on. It's so lovely.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think you're brilliant. As I said, we'll put up links everywhere so that you can follow Kirsty Jagger here and her sensational book, Roseghetto. It's a brilliant read. Please go out, do yourself a favour and read this book from cover to cover. It is not yet, I don't believe, available on Audible or in audio form as yet, but you never know. This may be coming down the track, but grab a copy of this book. It's beautiful. Congratulations yet again, Kirsty.
Thank you so much. There is an ebook at the moment.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. So you can get it online, but you won't get to listen to my lovely voice.
Not yet.
Not yet. So you don't want to listen to this voice. I'm going to imagine for that.
I've been enjoying listening to your voice.
Well, thank you.
So thank you so much for joining me in the confessional. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine. Available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.
Hey there! When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly.